There's a version of this story that most people saw. It was funny. It was warm. It lived on a phone screen, and it arrived in 30-second bursts. A man doing impressions so precise they made strangers laugh out loud on the train, in their bedroom, at midnight, at the kitchen table while their coffee went cold. He had a gift for it. The kind of gift that makes people feel like they know you. Like you were theirs, somehow. His name online was KingMask. And for a while, that name meant something simple. Laughter. A few minutes of your day that cost you nothing and gave you something back. Then there's the other version of this story. October 21st, 2021. San Diego, California. Two people shot inside an apartment. One of them, a woman named Elena. The other, her friend, a man named Marcus. The person who pulled the trigger was not a stranger to Elena. He was her husband. He was KingMask. You see, this is not a story about a monster. Monsters are easy. You can see them coming. This is a story about a man who spent years building a face that the world would love, and what happened to everyone around him when that face finally slipped. Before we get to what Dario Salinas did, we need to spend a little time with who Dario Salinas was, because that gap between the who and the what is the entire story. Dario grew up with a performer's instinct. The kind of kid who could do voices, who could read a room, who understood, maybe earlier than most, that making people laugh was a form of power, not the loud, aggressive kind. The quieter kind. The kind that makes people lean in. When TikTok began its rise, that strange, algorithm-driven world where nobody from anywhere could wake up famous on a Tuesday, Dario found his stage. His content was impressions, mainly characters. Voices so accurate they felt like ventriloquism. He could become someone else entirely in the span of a breath, shift his posture, his cadence, his whole energy, and hold it there long enough to make you forget for a moment that you were watching a man alone in a room with a phone. The following grew slowly at first, the way these things always go, in sudden lurches, one video breaking through and carrying the next one with it. Comments flooded in. Shares multiplied. People tagged their friends. They said things like, "I found my people, and this man is too talented." They felt the way audiences always do with the best performers, that they were seeing something real. That was the trick of it. Dario was not playing a character when he was being KingMask. He was playing an amplified version of himself. The warmth turned up, the charm sharpened, the rougher edges smoothed away until what remained was someone that a stranger could love without any of the risk that comes with actually knowing a person. In interviews and live streams, he came across as grounded, grateful. He talked about his family. He made his wife and daughter part of the story he was telling. The relatable family man, building something real while the world watched. But an audience only ever sees what a performer chooses to show them. And there's always something happening just off camera. The people who actually knew Dario Salinas, the ones who were present for the conversations that didn't get filmed, the moments that didn't make the feed, they were beginning to see a different picture. One that didn't match the thumbnail, and we'll get to that. But first, you need to understand what he was protecting, what he had built, and what it meant to him. Because when you understand that, when you see how much of his identity was wrapped up in how the world perceived him, the rest of the story starts to make a terrible kind of sense. Elena Salinas was not a supporting character in her own life. That is the first thing to understand, and the most important. In stories like this one, there's always a risk, a gravitational pull toward the perpetrator, toward understanding his psychology, tracing the arc of his unraveling. And we will go there, but not before we spend time with Elena. By the accounts of those who knew her, Elena was sharp, funny in a way that was entirely her own, dry and observational, the kind of humor that catches you off guard. She was a mother who was present with her daughter Sophia in the way that matters, not performing parenthood, but actually doing it. The kind of mother Sophia would remember. She and Dario had come together the way many couples do, drawn by the pull of someone who felt, at the beginning, like an answer to something. He was charismatic. He made her laugh. He could make anyone laugh. And early on, that felt like enough. More than enough, but charisma is not character. And what Dario showed the world and what he brought home were not always the same thing. The reports that would later emerge from people close to the couple described a relationship that had been straining for years beneath the surface of the content. Jealousy that arrived early and never fully left. Arguments that started small and grew. A need, on Dario's part, to know where Elena was, who she was with, what she was doing, a need that did not ease with reassurance but tightened around it. Controlling behavior in relationships rarely announces itself. It does not arrive in one dramatic moment that makes the pattern obvious. It comes in small increments, a question that feels like concern, a request that sounds like love, a restriction that is framed as protection. And then one day you look up and realize that the walls have moved without you noticing. Elena noticed. She had been noticing for a while. The laughter was still there sometimes. So was the man she had chosen. But something else had grown up alongside him, something that did not know how to let go. The marriage was fracturing. And for a man whose entire public identity was built on the image of a warm, stable, likable family, that fracture was not just personal. It was existential. Because if the family fell apart, what story was he telling? What was left of KingMask when the family man part was gone? Elena could not have known the full weight of what she was carrying simply by being a woman who needed to leave. She was not responsible for his identity. She never was. But she was the one who would pay for it. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. While the marriage was deteriorating, while the arguments were escalating and the jealousy was becoming something harder to name, Dario Salinas was still posting, still performing, still showing up in comment sections to thank people for their support, still doing the impressions, still being KingMask to hundreds of thousands of people who had no idea that the man behind the screen was coming apart. That is not unusual. Exactly. Most people do not post their worst moments. We select. We show the parts of ourselves that we can stand to be seen. But with Dario, the gap between the performance and the reality was not just wide. It was becoming dangerous. Because performing the version of himself that people loved required maintaining the illusion that his life was what it appeared to be. And Elena's growing distance was a threat to that illusion. When we talk about control or relationships, we often focus on the visible forms, the raised voice, the restriction, the isolation. But control is also about narrative. It is about insisting that the story being told about your life is the one you have chosen. And when someone you love, someone who is woven into your public story, starts to write themselves out of it, the response could be catastrophic. The surveillance began in the way these things often do. Quietly, a check of phone. A question that revealed information she hadn't given him. The sense, for Elena, that she was being watched in a way she couldn't fully locate or prove. And then came the iPad. Dario Salinas installed an audio monitoring application on his daughter Sophia's tablet. Not for any reason that had to do with Sophia. He did it so that he could listen to Elena's conversations without her knowledge. He used his child's device, something associated entirely with innocence and safety, as a surveillance tool against his own wife. When this was discovered, it recontextualized everything. Because this was not impulsive. It was not a moment of panic or poor judgment. It required planning. It required him to look at his daughter's iPad and calculate how it could be useful to him. It required a coldness that sat very badly against the warmth he performed for cameras. This is the moment in the story where KingMask and Dario Salinas begin to look like genuinely different people. One of them made strangers laugh. The other planted a listening device in his child's bedroom. Both of them were the same man. Elena left. That sentence is simple. The reality of it was not. Leaving a relationship marked by control and jealousy is rarely a single event. It is a process, often long, that involves negotiating not just logistics but safety. The question of how to go is inseparable from the question of what happens when the other person finds out you have gone. She moved into her own apartment in San Diego. She had Sophia with her. She was trying to build something separate, a life with borders that were hers to set. Dario's response to the separation was not acceptance. It was an acceleration of everything that had already been present in the marriage. The jealousy, the need to know, the inability to tolerate the idea that she was living a life he could not see and therefore could not control. He became fixated on the question of whether Elena was seeing someone else. This fixation, which would later be described in detail during his trial, was not grounded in confirmed fact. It was the product of a mind that had always struggled to trust, now untethered from the proximity that had given it the illusion of control. He could no longer monitor her in person, so the obsession expanded to fill the space. He made contact repeatedly. He pushed against the boundaries of the separation in the way that people who cannot accept endings often do. Testing, pressing, looking for the moment when she would relent and restore the story he needed to be true. She did not relent, and as the weeks passed, something in Dario Salinas began to calcify. The jealousy stopped being diffuse and started narrowing toward a specific fear that she had moved on, that there was someone else in the apartment, that the life she was building without him had already made room for another person. Whether that fear was rooted in anything real is, in some ways, beside the point. What matters is what he did with it. And what he did with it was not call a friend, was not speak to a therapist or a family member who might have offered a railing to hold on to. What he did with it was let it become a conclusion, a verdict, something that required a response. The distance between the jealous thought and the acted upon one is where most people stop. They feel it, they suffer it, and they do not cross it. That line is the whole of civilization, in a sense. Dario Salinas crossed it. Marcus Webb was 31 years old. He is often reduced, in the telling of this story, to his role in it. The man who was present that evening, the man whose presence Dario interpreted as confirmation of his fears. But Marcus Webb was a person with a full life before October 21st, 2021, and he deserves to be seen as one. He was a friend of Elena's. Not a secret, not a scandal, a friend. Someone she trusted, someone who was part of her life in a way that friends are present at ordinary moments, on an ordinary evening, in the apartment of a woman who was rebuilding her life after leaving a difficult marriage. His family would later describe him in the way that the people left behind always describe those they've lost, with the specific, irreplaceable details that make a person real. The way he laughed, what he cared about, who he was to the people who knew him best. He was not an abstraction. He was not a variable in someone else's paranoid equation. He was a man who had done nothing wrong. In the days before October 21st, those who encountered Dario later described a man who seemed wound-tight. He had been cycling through the obsession that had taken hold of him since the separation. The conviction that Elena was with someone, that she had replaced him, that the life she was constructing in his absence was a humiliation he could not absorb. Jealousy of this kind is not rational, and it does not respond to rational input. It is a closed system. Every piece of information that enters it gets bent toward the conclusion it has already reached. A text she doesn't answer quickly enough. A car he doesn't recognize outside her building. Silence where there used to be access. All of it becomes evidence. All of it confirms what he has already decided is true, that he had the listening app. He had what he believed he had heard. He had a story in his head about what was happening in that apartment. And on the evening of October 21st, he decided to go and find out for himself. Elena did not know he was coming. Marcus did not know he was coming. Sophia was not there. What happened next took less time than it takes to describe it. But the consequences of it will last for the rest of every life it touched. October 21st, 2021 evening, San Diego. Dario Salinas drove to Elena's apartment. He had made up his mind about what he was going to find there, and when he arrived, he found Marcus Webb In all his anger and rage, he shot both of them. Elena survived. Marcus Webb did not. The investigators who would later reconstruct the sequence of events and describe it with the precision that forensic work requires. Angles, distances, timing. The language of evidence. What the evidence showed was a man who had come to that apartment with intention, who had not arrived and found something that surprised him into action, who had made a decision in whatever hours or days preceded this evening and had carried it through. Elena was shot. She survived. The word survive covers an enormous amount. The immediate physical reality of it, yes, but also everything that comes after. The recovery, the courtrooms, the years of living in the aftermath of a night when someone had once promised to love her tried to end her life. Marcus Webb was 31 years old. He had come to spend an evening with a friend. He had done nothing to Dario Salinas or had never done anything to Dario Salinas. His presence in that apartment was the sum total of his involvement in this story, and it cost him everything. There is a version of true crime storytelling that leans into this moment, that dwells in the detail of it, that uses the violence as the dramatic centerpiece around which everything else orbits. We're not going to do that, because Elena is a person who is still alive and living with what happened to her, because Marcus Webb's family is still living with the absence of him, because the most honest thing we can do with this moment is to say it plainly and then sit in the full weight of what it means. Dario Salinas shot 2 people in an apartment in San Diego on an October evening, and then he walked out. He did not run. That is the detail that tends to stop people when they hear this story for the first time, and it deserves to be looked at carefully, because the absence of flight is not, by itself, evidence of remorse. It is evidence of something, but we should be careful about what conclusions we draw from it. What Dario Salinas allegedly did, after leaving Elena's apartment, was get in his car and call his mother. Carmen Salinas received a phone call from her son that evening. According to the prosecution's account of events, he told her what he had done, not in the clinical language of a confession, not as someone turning themselves in, but in the way that people in shock sometimes reach for the person who has always been the first call. The person who, in every preceding crisis, had known what to do. There is no good way to be Carmen Salinas in that moment. No script for what you do when your child tells you something that cannot be untold. We do not know exactly what was said. We do not know exactly what she did next. What we know is that the call happened, and that after it, Dario Salinas went to collect his daughter, Sophia. His daughter, who was 4 years old and somewhere safe, and who did not know what her father had just done. He then went on to pick her up and continued the mundane actions of a parent at the end of an ordinary evening, performed by a man who had just committed 2 shootings, as if the world had a next step for him, and he was simply following it. The police arrested him not long after. The investigation moved quickly. There was evidence. There were witnesses. There was the phone call to his mother. He did not disappear. He did not construct a cover story elaborate enough to require dismantling. He was found where someone who had not run could be found. KingMask posted his last video before any of this happened. As of the time of recording, some of those videos are still on the platform. The comment sections beneath them do not know what the person commenting does not know. That the man doing the impression, the man making them laugh, was already living in the aftermath of what he had done. The feed does not update when someone is arrested. It just sits there, preserved as a record of the version of himself he chose to perform. The trial of Dario Salinas was not a mystery. It was not a case built on ambiguity or circumstance. The prosecution had evidence. They had the phone call to his mother. They had the surveillance app on Sophia's tablet, a detail that, when presented in court, illustrated not just the jealousy, but the calculated nature of it. They had Elena, who had survived. Elena sat in that courtroom. She sat across the room from the man who had shot her, who had killed her friend, who had once been the person she chose. She was present for the legal proceedings that would determine what happened to him next. The courage that requires to be in the same room to not disappear, to insist on being seen when every instinct might be pulling toward escape, is not a small thing. It should be named. The defense made their arguments. They raised questions about state of mind, about the circumstances, about the evidence. That is what a defense is for. The jury heard everything and returned with their verdict. Guilty on both counts. The murder of Marcus Webb. The attempted murder of Elena Salinas. The sentence came in 2024. Life in prison. No parole, no future in which Dario Salinas returns to a phone camera and an audience waiting for the next impression. No version of the KingMask story that has a second act. Marcus Webb's family was in that courtroom too. They had attended the proceedings with the particular exhaustion of people who have been waiting a long time for a moment that cannot actually give them what they need. A verdict is not a restoration. It is an acknowledgement. It says, what happened to your person was wrong, and the person who did it will be held. It does not say, he is coming back. It cannot say that. The families of victims in cases like this one are often asked how they feel about the outcome. The honest answer is usually that outcome is the wrong word entirely. There is no outcome. There is only what came before and what happened and the long stretch of life that follows, lived in the shape of what was lost. Dario Salinas will spend the rest of his life in a cell. The people he hurt will spend the rest of theirs carrying what he did. The videos are still there. That is the strange, specific texture of this story in the digital age. The archive does not update when the person in it is convicted of murder. The algorithm does not flag the content. The comment sections remain exactly as they were, full of people who laughed at what they saw and had no reason to look behind it. Somewhere in a California state prison, Dario Salinas is serving a life sentence. And online, KingMask is still posting. Frozen in the last moment before the fall, Elena survived. That word again, survived, doing so much work in so few letters. She is alive. She is raising Sophia. She is living the life that someone tried to take from her on an October evening in San Diego. We do not know, and it is not our place to know what that looks like from the inside. What we can say is that she is here, and that being here under those circumstances is its own form of quiet courage. Marcus Webb's family carries an absence that will not close. He was 31. He had a whole middle section of his life ahead of him. The part where things accumulate, where relationships deepen, where a person starts to become fully themselves. He never got there. He was at his friend's apartment on an ordinary Tuesday, and then he was gone. This story is often framed as a story about social media, about the danger of the curated self, about what happens when the performance becomes more real than the reality. And there is truth in that framing. The gap between KingMask and Dario Salinas is genuinely wide and genuinely worth thinking about. But I think it is also something simpler and older. It is a story about what happens when someone mistakes possession for love. When the need to control another person is so total that their freedom, their ordinary human right to leave, to rebuild, to spend an evening with a friend, is experienced as an act of aggression. When jealousy stops being an emotion and becomes a verdict, Dario Salinas had everything that the algorithm rewards. The charm, the talent, the following, the face that read as safe. None of it was a lie, exactly. That is the most uncomfortable part. The person his audience loved was real. He was also capable of this. We like to believe that people who do terrible things are visible beforehand, that there are signs we would have caught, warnings we would have heeded, a quality in the eyes or the laugh that would have told us. Sometimes there are. Often there are not. Often the person who does the unthinkable is, until the moment they do it, the person in the comments section that everyone likes. And so ends the tragic tale of the man behind the mask.